The overdiagnosis of osteopenia is a striking example of how medical definitions can be subtly shifted to transform millions of healthy individuals into patients in need of pharmaceutical intervention. Ostensibly a pre-disease state, referring to lower than average bone mineral density, BMD, but not low enough to qualify as osteoporosis, osteopenia became a catch-all category after the World Health Organization, WHO, formalized bone density thresholds in the 1990s. This classification, intended primarily for epidemiological research, was soon co-opted by pharmaceutical interests and clinical practice to justify drug treatment in people who were not necessarily at high risk of fracture. The result was a surge in prescriptions for bisphosphonates like Fosamax, alendronate, Boniva, and Actonol, drugs originally developed for severe bone disease, but increasingly given to people with mild or even clinically insignificant bone loss. The profits were enormous, but the health benefits were often negligible, and in some cases, the treatment posed more risk than the condition it was meant to prevent. The story begins with a statistical benchmark. In 1994, the WHO defined osteoporosis as a BMD 2.5 standard deviations below the young adult female mean, measured via DEXA, dual-energy X-ray absorptiometry, scans. Osteopenia was defined as between 1.0 and 2.5 standard deviations below that same mean. On paper, these were research tools intended to study bone health at the population level. But once these categories were adopted into clinical guidelines and reinforced by widespread screening campaigns, they effectively redefined the patient population. Millions of postmenopausal women who had no history of fractures or symptoms of bone weakness were now told they had a condition, osteopenia, that might lead to osteoporosis, and were urged to start long-term drug treatment just in case. Pharmaceutical companies quickly recognized the commercial potential of this newly expanded patient pool. Merck, the maker of Fosamax, funded aggressive awareness campaigns about bone loss, supported screening initiatives, and sponsored educational materials that highlighted the dangers of untreated osteopenia. DEXA scanning equipment was placed in more doctors' offices, and mobile screening vans began targeting malls, workplaces, and retirement communities. The narrative was clear and persuasive. Bone loss is silent but deadly, and early intervention is key. The fact that many people labeled with osteopenia had only slightly below average BMD and no other risk factors for fractures was minimized or ignored. This framing turned aging itself into a treatable pathology. A normal decline in bone density with age, especially in postmenopausal women, was now seen as a precursor to disease rather than a variation of healthy physiology. The fear-based messaging, combined with direct-to-consumer advertising, led many women to start bisphosphonate therapy for osteopenia, believing it was their only defense against future fractures. But the scientific support for treating osteopenia with these drugs was limited at best. Most clinical trials of bisphosphonates showed significant fracture prevention only in patients with osteoporosis, not in those with osteopenia or low fracture risk. In fact, the absolute risk reduction for fractures in osteopenic patients is so small that for many, the number needed to treat an NT is extremely high, meaning many people must take the drug for years to prevent a single fracture in one. And the drugs themselves are not benign. Bisphosphonates can cause gastrointestinal distress, esophageal irritation, and in rare but serious cases, osteonecrosis of the jaw, a painful condition in which bone tissue in the jaw dies. Long-term use has also been associated with atypical femoral fractures, paradoxically weakening bones by suppressing the natural remodeling process. Despite these risks, patients were often kept on bisphosphonates for years, sometimes even decades, without reevaluation of their risk profile. This overmedication wasn't driven by updated science. It was driven by market logic and inertia, where patients, once diagnosed, were more likely to remain on the treatment than question its necessity. Critics of this trend, including medical ethicists and public health experts, have pointed to osteopenia as a textbook case of disease-mongering, where normal variations in health are pathologized in order to expand the customer base for medications. The concept of pre-disease has enormous commercial utility. It creates anxiety about future illness, encourages early treatment, and shifts the focus from acute care to long-term, preventive pharmacotherapy. In the case of osteopenia, this meant billions in profits for drug makers, while patients were exposed to the risks and costs of a therapy with uncertain benefit. Perhaps most troubling is the way in which regulatory bodies and professional societies were slow to address the overreach. Even after evidence accumulated that bisphosphonates provided little benefit to low-risk patients, treatment guidelines remained vague and screening practices continued unchecked. Only after the FDA began issuing warnings about rare side effects in the mid-2000s did prescriptions begin to taper off, but by then, millions had already been treated unnecessarily. In hindsight, the overdiagnosis of osteopenia is not just a cautionary tale about one condition. It is a broader indictment of how commercial forces can subtly reshape the boundaries of illness, redefine health, and sell fear under the guise of prevention. The medicalization of risk, especially when it is not accompanied by a proportionate benefit, creates a system in which people are encouraged to see themselves as perpetually at the edge of disease. This psychological burden, along with the physical risks of unnecessary medication, is the hidden cost of a healthcare system too easily influenced by profit.